Good evening, friends. A very warm welcome to you on behalf of Sahitya Akademi and DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. And and I cordially welcome Arshia Sattar and Malashri Lal who will be the speakers today. And before that, I would request Ashok, who is from DSC Prize, to say a few words.
Thank you, Raj. First of all, it's a pleasure and honor for us to be doing this event along with the Sahitya Akademi. And along with me, there's Amrita, there's Virinola, and Ritu Bose from the DSC Prize. And of course, I also welcome Arshia, was an old friend, you know, the DSC Prize jury, as well as Malashri Lal, who's made this thing happen in the first place. A lot of big thank you to you. So the DSC Prize is basically an international prize on fiction, which has been around for 6 years now. It was started in 2010. Its main mandate is to highlight, reward the best writing of the South Asian region. And the best part is that authors of any ethnicity or any part of the world are eligible to write, as long as writing about South Asia. It could be from any part of the world. It could be a Frenchman writing about Afghanistan and new religion. And it also, in a way, encourages translation in the sense that in case of translator entry wins, the prize is shared equally between the translator and the original author. So the DSC Prize 2017 is now underway. In fact, we have just formed the jury and we want to move forward on that. But apart from that, the DSC Prize also does a lot of events where it tries to talk of various issues which are linked with South Asian writing. And that's one of the reasons why we do these events today. We felt that the role of the epics in modern contemporary Indian writing, not only in India but also in areas around the South Asian region, is quite prominent and significant. And we thought it is something which will be of a lot of interest to all of us here, especially when we have a person like Arshia Sattar and Malashri Lal talking about these. So we'll not keep you away from the main part of the conversation. We'll just hand you back to the panel. She will introduce the
very brief introductions, because I'm sure you all are very keen to hear them. Arshia Sattar is the founder and co-editor of Sangam House International Writers Residency. Her biodata is indeed very impressive, but I'll just say a few key points. She's a PhD from the University of Chicago, and she is the author of several books, including translations from Sanskrit, the Uttarakhand Ramayana of Valmiki, Tales from Kathasarit Sagar. She has several books for children: the Ramayana for Children, Adventures with Hanuman, Pampa Sutra, Kishkinda Tales. Her other books include Lost Loves, Exploring Drama's Anguish, a series of essays on the Valmiki Ramayana that considers the epic characters from a contemporary perspective. She was shortlisted for the Crossword Economist Non-Fiction Award in 2012. The Mouse Merchant, collection of Sanskrit stories about money and wealth in a series edited by Bhucharan Das. And she has received several honors and awards, including the Reddick House Writers Residency Fellowship, USA Rockefeller Writing Fellowship, Bellagio, Italy, Fulbright Scholar in Residence, Amherst MA, and Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship for Translation, and the Writers Omi Residency Fellowship, New York. She's okay. Then briefly about Malashri. They did not join us, not fair. Professor Malashri retired recently from her position as the Dean of Colleges, Dean Academic Activities and Projects, and also Chairperson Research Council at the University of Delhi. As a recipient of prestigious fellowship, she has conducted research in Harvard University, USA, Bellagio, Italy, and Newcastle, UK, focusing on literature for social change. Malashri Lal's specialization is in literature, women, and gender studies, about which she has 14 books, including The Law of the Threshold, Women Writers in Indian English, In Search of Sita, Revisiting Mythology, Champa Achamba, Women's Oral Narratives, and Tagore and the Feminine, A Journey Through Translations. And recently she has edited a book for the Sahitya Akademi, the Anthology of Fantasy, and in which Arshia is there. And Malashri is currently the convener of the English Advisory board of the Sahitya Academy. I welcome both of you and I request Mala to begin the...
Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a great joy to be part of this afternoon's discussions, deliberations, and to get another chance to listen to Dr. Arshia Sattar. As you've heard, that she has a very impressive background indeed. But she is one of those rare people, not only with deep scholarship, but she wears this scholarship lightly when she speaks. And she is one of the most engaging speakers. and she's one of those who can tell you why Hanuman can speak Sanskrit and why elephants can fly. So mythology makes all of that possible. And with her immense command over the literary material of mythology, I'm sure this evening's talk will be most engaging and very informative. So over to you, Arshia.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mala. Thank you, Gitanjali. Thank you, Basho. This is a terribly intimidating table. I'm not used to sitting on the throne, as it were, but it's simply because I'm among three very good friends, not just people who are friends with Gitanjali, Mala, and Basho, but people who I have a lot of respect for the work that they do, but more importantly, the way in which they do it. So, really, thank you for coming together to bring me here. You know, the stars have to align for these things to happen. So my topic this evening is the influence of epics on modern India and South Asian writing. But with an apology to my dear friends who brought me here, I will restrict myself to talking about the epics in India, for that is what I know best, rather than speaking of and to the rest of the South Asian subcontinent. Interestingly, and Basho mentioned it briefly, we might have thought about the influence of the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata specifically, on literatures in countries somewhat farther afield, Southeast Asia, for example, where both these beloved stories that we claim as ours have remarkable cultural, if not religious, traction. Both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata provide India with a vocabulary of characters and images, of proverbs and idioms, of gestures and nuances, and now, more dangerously so, they provide us also with a vocabulary of nationalism and ideology. Their influence extends well beyond writing and literature in India, but since we're in the hallowed halls of the Sahitya Academy, I'll stay in the slightly less contested realms of how and why we continue to tell these stories today. So let me start with the idea of form, as in the way epics, in particular, tell their stories. Most obviously, the epics move in strange and mysterious ways, looping and meandering and running away into tributary stories, while keeping their primary narrative moving forward inexorably towards the restoration of Dharma. Some contemporary writers in English replicate this form. For the moment, I can think of Alan Seeley's Trotternaama, Vikram Chandra's Red Earth and Pouring Rain, Salman Rushdie's better books, such as Shalimar the Clown and the magnificent Satanic Verses. But this style of, the baggy, saggy narrative is more common in Hindi, and I imagine so in other Indian languages as well. Think of the sprawling narratives of Raat Barbari, or Viti Diwari, or Al-Hagam. Literally, hundreds of characters come and go. Some of them change the course of history, others do not. Some of them change the course of the story, but others do not. But it matters little. And because, as Indians, we're used to ruptures in the natural order of things, as we listen to or read stories. For example, the ghost who lives under the tree and possessed the girl who climbed up with her head open, at noon. Of course, there's a family story also. Somebody's idea, he was father who was So there's the local booth or the dying. There's also the flying monkey who speaks Sanskrit, whose name I will not take because, he's mysterious. There's a dwarf who can cover the universe in 3 strides, and of course the elephants that fly. So we're used to this, right? So a little magical realism, and I use the quote marks advisedly, a little magical realism tossed into an Indian story here or there passes almost unnoticed. It's fun for us when children born on the stroke of a magical midnight meet inside the head of a boy who has a monstrous snot-filled nose, or when a man plunges 29,000 feet through the air singing a song about his hat and his coat and survives the fall. This is not magical realism for us, this is simply how good stories are told. But for me, what is much more significant is how the content of our myth and epic remain with us, even in the new stories that we tell. We could turn to the sublime confidence of the Mahabharata for an answer to the question of why we continue to tell the same stories, even when our experience of the world has changed so radically. The Mahabharata, as we all know, says about itself, whatever is here is found elsewhere, but what is not here is nowhere. We cannot tell new stories apparently, but what we can do, dear Mahabharata, is to tell old stories in new ways, even your stories. So there are ways and ways in which we can retell old stories. You might, as Shashi Tharoor did, in his modestly named The Great Indian Novel, place the Mahabharata and its characters in a new setting and tell a story that explains the birth of a nation. You could, like Mani Ratnam, call your film Ravan and tell a story about a police officer's wife who's kidnapped by a brigand who's actually a rebel against the state. Today, of course, we might call that same brigand anti-national. But every illegitimate son in a contemporary story is not Karna, nor is every abducted wife Sita. But for this evening, I'm going to focus on contemporary literatures and storytelling, where Sita is the Sita of Ramayana, and Karna is the Karna of the Mahabharata, and Shiva is the blue-throated god that we already know. So let's look at some of the more recent ways in which these stories are being told. And I want to talk about literature and the way we tell our stories, but I also want to talk about history. I throw history into this mix because I believe that in our current climate, these retellings, whether mythical or historical, whether truth or fiction, are all part of the same nationalistic enterprise. Or let me say less contentiously, they are all part of the same attitude towards the past and the present. And though the topic for this evening has acquired neutrality, I think that the influence of epics on modern South Asian writing, I think that we must not simply describe phenomena as the influence of the epics, but we must also analyze what we are describing. I believe that as scholars and as public intellectuals, this is not simply our training, but it is our obligation, it is our moral obligation to look beyond and below the surface of things. So I'm going to talk about these new mythologies, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with, and I'm sure many of us have read. Ashok Bankar's groundbreaking 7-volume Ramayana and his more recent writings from the Krishna cycle of stories, Amish's chart-busting Shiva trilogy, and the success of his first book in the Ramayana series, Devdutt Pattanayak's innumerable best-selling books on Indian myth and his newspaper columns, Anand Neelakantan's passionate partisanship of the so-called villains from the epics. He's just got a new book out, this week. Kavita Kane and Anita Chandramali's excavation of the minor women characters from the Indian epic. Amrita Patil's exquisite and subversive graphic texts that reach deep into the Mahabharata and the Puranas. Samhita Arni's delightfully dystopian The Missing Queen, which takes the Ramayana as the end of the Ramayana as we know it further. These are but a handful of writers and books that come immediately to mind from among scores of others who are busily rethinking, rewriting, and revisioning through words and pictures the stories that our grandmothers used to tell us, or that we encounter in our beloved and staggeringly influential Amar Chitra Katha. How many people remember learning Leibniz from Amar Chitra Katha? Everybody's not being on it, only 3 people are waiting, but I know there's many more people here who learned that mythology through them. So you throw into this mix a random newcomer like Trisha Das, and I believe her book is called Draupadi Miskuru, and her confabulation of Draupadi and her mothers-in-law dropping in on contemporary Delhi. And you begin to wonder if you are, in fact, living in Brahma's dream, with the gods at hand and illusion as the only truth. The rewriting of myth in India is a phenomenon so noteworthy that even something like The Economist, so highbrow and so the corporate reader. The Economist deigned to notice it, crediting Ashok Banka with being the first to go where we imagined that angels dared to tread, that is, into the minds and hearts of the gods. Of course, it is entirely true that the popularity of these new tellings in our country nestles within a larger worldwide explosion of reimagined pasts. From Peter Jackson's The Ring trilogy on screen and Neil Gaiman's recently published The Norse mythology, humans everywhere seem to be reaching for stories from ancient times. Maybe we're trying to understand who we are and how we got into this mess. Perhaps the stories we tell and the ways in which we tell them justify our current behaviors of greed and violence and the relentless quest for power. Or perhaps we read these stories to give us the faith that we need to overcome whatever counts as evil in our times. And if myths can be retold, why not their close cousin, history? Television's prime time, certainly in Hindi, is bursting at the seams with animated and performed serials about the gods, their sons, their childhoods, even their wives. These more traditional mythologicals are bracketed by lavish and righteous productions of legendary heroes and heroines of the past, making the hours between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. on weekdays a veritable smorgasbord of our mythic and historical glories. But apart from the sheer falsification of facts in both our sylvan groves of academia and in the hurly-burly of political rhetoric, there is also a veritable tsunami of books that place themselves in the genre of historical fiction and fantasy. Yeah, fiction and fantasy are now sort of on the same continuum. And historical is added to that, and you wonder, is that there an oxymoron here somewhere in historical fiction, historical fantasy? Maybe not. I mean, this is the post-truth era, we are in the 21st century. These historical fantasies, Sunil Ota's Unavi series is set in the Mauryan Empire. Shatrughat Nath's Vikramaditya trilogy takes its location from the imagined world of King Vikrama. Krishna Udaya Shankar's Aryavarta chronicles revolve around what might have been the imperial formations during the purported historical moment of the Mahabharata. These are all tales of swashbuckling adventure filled with gory battles, searing horse chases, and furtive love. They are people with brave warriors, cunning conspirators, and lovely ladies set against dark forces that gather on the borders of kingdoms and empires. These complex narratives recall Robert Graves' masterfully and memorably reconstructed palace intrigues and the expansion of the Roman Empire through books such as I, Claudius. Graves had studied the classics and read both Greek and Latin, but his writing contemporary, Mary Renaud, most famously the author of The Persian Boy, about Alexander's relationship with a young Persian slave, Mary Renaud created her historical worlds through meticulous research. Similarly, almost all the Indian writers creating these new historical fantasies count on the expertise of others to fill out the stories that they want to tell. They read translations, and avidly and conscientiously, they use as their sources any number of documentary materials. Since their access to the worlds they are imagining is mediated through what are essentially interpretations, perspectives, and opinions, it should come as no surprise that these writers are liberated from the evidence that constitutes historical fact. Translators and historians are tied to what they find in the materials they study, but writers are not. Their heroes of legend and history can be more heroic, their warriors more fearless, their weapons more magical, their women courageous and outspoken, their cities richer, their fields poorer, their enemies more diabolical. But the new mythologists, on the other hand, are already on surer ground in terms of how they choose to tell the stories that we already know. As a culture, we've been telling our myths in the ways that we want to tell them for centuries. There is no single version of a myth. Each telling is inflected by time and place, by caste and region, by politics and ideology, and by sectarian bias. Note, for example, the multiple birth stories of Hanuman. Most commonly, we know Hanuman to be the son of Vayu, the wind god, who impregnates Anjana, a cursed Apsara, who is in monkey form. In the Vaishnava universe, Hanuman and the other mighty monkeys were born of the gods to help Vishnu as Rama defeat Ravana. By the time we reach the 16th century and the Hanuman Chalisa, Hanuman is called, among other things in Chalisa, it's called Shankarasura, the son of Shankara. This is probably because by then, 1600 years after Valmiki had composed his poem, this is probably because by then Shiva Purana had claimed Hanuman as its own. In the Shiva Purana, he is born from the seed of Shiva, which falls onto a leaf, which is carried by a bird who is propelled by Vayu, and the seed slips into Anjana's open mouth. She's on top of a mountain with her mouth open, and Shiva's seed falls in there. One can imagine 100 reasons why this myth was retold, especially at a time when religious identities needed to be strengthened and manifested. For example, with the growth of sectarian Hinduism, it could have been that the Shaivites wanted a share in the story of Rama. How better to enter it than through its most charismatic and beloved character, through Hanuman. Further, the story demonstrates that if not for Hanuman, who is now the son of Shiva, Vishnu would not have been able to kill Ravana and win Sita back. So too, the new mythologies are located, our new mythologies are located in the times and spaces that created them. Trisha Das's Mr. Draupadi Kuru from 2016 shows us how venal and corrupt contemporary Delhi is and suggests that women in the 21st century have far fewer freedoms than their female ancestors. Samhita Arni's The Missing Queen is from 2013 and Neelakantan's Asura from 2012 both envision a dystopic Ayodhya, albeit for very different reasons. Arni's Ayodhya is authoritarian and without freedom of thought and speech, whereas Neelakantan's Ayodhya is imperialistic, expanding its boundaries and imposing its harsh rigidities of caste and gender upon lands and people that it conquers. Neelakantan's Ravana fights Ayodhya and all that it stands for in order to preserve his, that is his Dravidian people's, egalitarian way of life. Samhita Arni's woman journalist, rose in search of Sita, is hounded by a government that wants to keep its secrets. The deadly conflicts of Amisha's Sion and Ikshvaku from 2015 are set against the backdrop of a brutal trade war between Kosala and Lanka. It's probably worth it to look at another native phenomenon that preceded this current efflorescence of remaking myths in English. Modern and contemporary writers in regional languages have been creating, questioning, and subversive narratives for characters from myth and epic for decades. Long before there was Divakaruni's The Palace of Illusions in 2008 about Draupadi, there was Pratibha Rai's Yagniseni in 1984, which is written in Uriya. Kavita Kahani's Sita's Sister in 2014 is long preceded by Srikanta Nayar's Malayalam play Kanchana Sita in 1961, which is one among many of his Ramayana-based works. And in Kanchana Sita, it's Urmila who challenges Rama's view of karma and the basis for ethical behavior. More currently, Volga's Telugu stories about Sita are truly radical in terms of how she envisions such characters as Shurpanakha and Ahalya. Sarah Joseph's Malayalam stories from the Ramayana use minor characters such as Angada to examine the dominant ideology of the epic. So apart from literary merit and a perceived multiplicity of possible narratives about the past that these new retellings of myth and history promise, the times that we live in require that we consider what other purposes they might serve. Are these narratives very multiple, or are they truly diverse? Do they speak in othered voices? Do they represent new spaces of empowerment? Do they intentionally or inadvertently support hegemonic cultures and politics? Turning a villain into a hero does not subvert a dominant ideology if the narrative remains fundamentally patriarchal in its content. So too, writing from the point of view of a woman or a minor character does not necessarily redraw the margins or push towards the center. Devdutt Pattanayak's The Pregnant King in 2008 uses the Mahabharata story of the king Yuvanashva, who accidentally gets pregnant by drinking the magic potion meant for his wives. So he uses the story of Yuvanashva to begin an examination of gender as socially constructed identity rather than as biological destiny. It may be hard to think of an ancient text addressing these ideas, but Patnaik, by telling Yuvanasha's story the way he does, or retelling it at all, opens up that possibility for us. He opens up the possibility for us to consider gender as a social construct rather than as biological destiny. And if that idea is too far-fetched, then we, as 21st century readers, can still enjoy new wine in old bottles, as it were, refracting the concerns of our times through the lens of a story where unlikely things are possible because of magic. Keeping in mind how we choose to retell stories and how we pick the ones that we do, the larger question is not why we are retelling our own stories, because we've been doing that forever, myths and legends and histories. The question is, why are we retelling them now? And why are we telling so many of them in English and for a largely urban readership? The simple answer is that more and more of us have lost touch with our languages, with our traditional storytellers, with our so-called roots, and therefore with our sense of self. If we believe this to be a crisis rather than somewhat natural, if we believe this loss of our roots, etc., to be a crisis rather than a somewhat natural, accelerated social transition, then we all need to hear and tell the old stories again, but in ways that resonate with the realities of our times, in idiom, both linguistic and political. Our gods and heroes, this is how the stories are being retold, our gods and heroes must be muscled and battle-ready. Our women, there are almost no goddesses in these new retellings. Our women must be feisty, but they must not be threatening. We must speak of country, but we must imply nation, that is India. Most of all, in our new retellings, we must speak of danger to a way of life, a danger that culminates in war. Yeah, I believe that these are the subtexts of the new retellings that we are that are flowering around us, and they are flowering in this way and with these particular motifs and themes and elements precisely because they think we are in a crisis, yeah, of losing not simply our roots and our languages, but actually of losing ourselves. Popular mythological and history books that carry these subtexts of danger and war, and there are many, participate in the idea of a culture under siege, threatened from within and from without. Such fictions play easily into the singular national and therefore nationalist narrative that is being developed around us. The rhetoric of the fictions is strengthened by the fact that they are stories about gods. With that alone, they must be both right and they must be righteous, even if they are not true. When the gods themselves are made to act in favor of exceptions and exclusions from the narrative that is created to define us, then truly there is nowhere in the universe to hide, not even in Patala, as the traditional outsiders, the Asuras, used to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arshia, for a very thoughtful and well-argued, wide-ranging set of references, and to interrogate a situation as to why are we telling these stories now, and why are so many of these stories being told in English. So in the conversation that I planned to have, maybe about 20 minutes. So if I could just pick up some of the strands from your speech and take them a little further. So first and foremost, this idea of a living mythology. As you say, that we have been forever telling stories, but are we telling them differently now? What is wonderful is that we're telling them in all our languages, including English. And it seems to me, especially where we are right now in the Sahitya Akademi, the fact that these retellings are bridging across languages through retellings and through translations is to be a very significant phenomenon. You're quite right in saying there are certain kind of Indians who have been brought up on the diet of the English education and its heritage, or the diaspora Indians, who are feeling a sense of rootlessness, and the retelling of the mythologies and the those documents. And that may be one of the reasons why the retelling is happening. So in the range that you have mentioned, which includes diaspora writers such as Banerjee and Fallon, which looks at the Mahabharata through Draupadi's eyes, or you're looking at Amish Tripathi, who is our English bestseller, who is reinventing the ancient movies. Do you find anything different about the diaspora retellings and the in the country retellings?
Yes and no. Chitra Devakruti Banerjee grew up in India, right? So she went, as far as I know, she went to America to live and work after that. So she's not second generation. I mean, I don't think she would participate in this idea that she's disconnected from her roots. But what I'm interested more in is how Bhasha language writers, I believe that they exist in the living mythology in a way that urban, deracinated, English-educated young people do not. And I'm not using any of these words critically. I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be urban and deracinated and English-educated and English-speaking. But I think we inhabit those worlds very differently. What interests me is that urban Indians, English-educated Indians, are reading English translations and English versions of these stories and regurgitating them for other people like themselves. Right? And again, it's not a value judgment, that's exactly what's going on. And I think the problem is that, no, I take that back, there's no problem. It is substantially different from the way Bhasha speaker, for example, knows Mahabharata. And I know that one of your questions was, is it because of lost languages that we're all succumbing to a mainstream narrative? No, I think we're succumbing to a mainstream narrative. English readers are succumbing to a mainstream narrative because there is only one. But the Uriya reader and the Gujarati reader and the Tamil reader and the Garhwali reader are all inhabiting multiple Mahabharatas at the same time. And if they talk to each other, they all know that they're talking Mahabharata, but they're talking different Mahabharatas. Right? So I think the mainstream narrative is because we are functioning only in one language. Right? And also because the people who are writing these English narratives are functioning out of the same language, not another. So I don't think that. I think that there's a huge problem with translation here. They're not even translating themselves. They're not even like reading translations. They're reading other English versions. So there is a collusion of narratives, which could be entirely accidental, but you've got to think about whether it's accidental.
That's a very helpful answer indeed. I want to also pick up the second query. Your references to magic realism. Of course. I see so many of my teacher colleagues here. And again, we credit to Salman Rushdie, that's when the term was invented. But as you rightly say, magic realism is an existing feature in our index. And it's just because our theoretical formulations in the classroom, in our curriculum, come from a certain kind of a Western intellectual traditions. If you're looking at magic realism and linking it to Salman Rushdie or the Latin American writers, to Marquis, and we are forgetting that actually magic realism is exactly as you said, when Hanuman reads Sanskrit and Hellions get why? That's the magic realism. And nobody cares. And nobody cares.
It's so naturalized in our writing, we didn't need to name it.
We didn't need to name it, but did we not name it? I'm going back to Bharatanatyam Shastra and the theory of the rasa. So if we're looking for alternate critical theories, and I think we should, then we do have something called the rasa, and a lot of the so-called components of the magic realism that we deal with, post Salman Rushdie, actually can very well fit into that what should be our strategy for literary interpretation of the Vedas when we're looking at magical words?
Okay, mine, just before I came here, I was talking to somebody, and I said, recently, in the last couple of years, I reread Midnight's Children. It is horrible. It is unreadable. It is overwritten. It is obtuse. It is like dull. You know, and I was thinking, like, wow. I mean, this one book that unleashed magical realism in Indian literature. I was so surprised that, you know, 20 years later, it just hasn't stood the test of any kind of time. Of course, I mean, this is my opinion. I'm sure there are people who think it's a great book. But again, I think, you know, within our own myths, or even within Bhasha literatures, I think it's completely reasonable to think about Adbhuta and Bhayankara and Hasya and all the other rasas that Bharata and Anandavardhana and Reni so helpfully gave us. But I think when we talk about Saman Rushdie, we have to use a category magical realism because he's doing it deliberately and consciously, and he wants you to notice, oh look, this is a rupture. You know, when we do it in our own stories, nobody cares that Hanuman is lying and speaking Sanskrit. In fact, I mean, when Hanuman meets Lakshmana in Rama, in Kishkinda, the first time they enter, and Sugriva says, oh, go find out who they are. And he goes, and he's talking to them in Sanskrit, and Lakshmana says to him, oh, what good Sanskrit you speak, not how come you're speaking to me in Sanskrit, right? Which you would think would be the more natural question. And this, you know, this illusion continues until Sita, when Hanuman comes to Ashoka Vatika, and he sees her and she's crying, he says, how am I going to approach her? Because surely she's going to become a Rakshasa, you know, she's so frightened, and all these people have been around her, and they're, you know, tricksters and masters of illusion. And so he decides that he's going to sing to her the praises of Rama, because no Rakshasa would ever do that, right? So he starts to do that, and Sita's first reaction is like, oh my god, this is a monkey that's speaking Sanskrit, this cannot be true, it must be a Rakshasa, right? So until that point in the Ramayana, which is in Sundarakanda, right? We are 3/4 into the book, somebody said, how is this monkey speaking Sanskrit? Until that point, nobody had even said. Yeah, not a grandfather, not a child, nobody in the story, nobody outside the story. So it's not, when we have magic in our own story, it's a naturalized magic. But when Rushdie uses it, hey, look what I'm doing. You know? So I think that when we speak about Indian writing in English, I think it might be more correct, more appropriate to use Western critical terminology, because that's what English writers are responding to. They're not responding to our own critical vocabulary or our terms of criticism or our aesthetic categories. So Salman Rushdie is going to remain a magical realist, you know, albeit an increasingly not exciting one.
Certainly a good argument, but I do like Midnight's Children. Yeah, I do. It's a brilliantly written book, and there are certain reconstructions of history which I find absolutely fascinating. And certainly, the fact that it updated the new style of writing and brought about almost like a watershed in what was happening. It's a sort of a derivative writing up to a point, and it gave a new confidence to Indian writing in English, and it also, I think, by crafting the language, back again to that word simplification, it gave the confidence to play around with the English language, which did not exist before. So from that point of view, I do think that it's a very important book. And then let's go back to the impact and the influence of the epics. Now, you of course mentioned the influence of the epics within the country, and you said this was really not the time to go into detail because we just don't have that time. But I find it absolutely fascinating that in countries like Indonesia, Bali, that the Ramayana has become theatrical performance, and it is not a living public language for us in India, at least for many of us in India. So what are your thoughts about the performative aspect of the epic, which has influenced much more than India, and in fact pervades the South Asian region?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things over the last, I sort of became aware of these sort of performance performative folk traditions in the mid-1980s. Maybe a good urban kid, I have to learn about them somewhere else. But since then, since the mid-80s, it's been so sad for me that Mahabharata is performed more than Ramayana. Obviously, because Ramayana is about internal conflict, and Mahabharata is Kumara, there are very many theatrical moments in Mahabharata which Ramayana doesn't have. Also, you know, for me, another huge revelation of how the epics live with us was Dharmini Bharti's Andhayog, which of course was written in the late 50s as a radio play and then became sort of staple of LSD and so many other people, Radan Pian's work from Kurdish Repertory Theatre in Manipur. So the epics, again, on our contemporary stage, the epics really live in non-English languages. And the performance of the folk traditions, of course, people are performing Mahabharata every year. In the South and so many other performative traditions in other places. So are those the traditions that traveled with it? Did the Mahabharata go to the Southeast Asia? To the performative traditions? I think not. I think it really went with the stories, right? And I mean, any great story, you tell a kid Ramayana and immediately getting up and they do Hanuman and jumping and all that. Just any good story, just you want to be in it. You want to be that person, so you start acting it. So I don't think it's the performative traditions that took the story to the East. I think the stories went and they said, oh well, yeah. And they do a lot more Ramayana performances than we do. In Thailand and certainly in the shadow puppetry in Bali and
talking about the relationships that exist within the epics and how they are being revisited by contemporary writers, both in English and certainly many more in the regional languages. One of the stories which is now doing the rounds in terms of critique of motherhood is the Karna-Kunti relationship. And I'm reminded of the fact, because Bengali is one of the languages that have access to words, which was written some time ago, but nevertheless, it was a critique of the relationship, and it was not a celebration of Kunti's position on the motherhood. So the thought scene, the very tense scene that the word creates is that Kunti goes to Karna on the eve of the battle. And the board changes the scene from midday, as it is in the original Ramayana, to late evening. And he does it very deliberately, probably for the poetic impression that he can create of this woman, wrinkled, bearing, standing in the shadow, and Karna wondering what is this lady doing here. And then Kunti walks up to him, and after a while, does reveal her identity. And then Karna, very beautiful poetry, and he says that I've always wondered about a dream that I have had. And in this dream, there was a shadowy woman who would come to me. She seemed recognizable, and yet I did not know her. And now that you have come, who are you? And then she says that in that one line that I'm your mother. And then the story of how the young Kunti was curious about her sexuality, how she prayed to the sun god and was impregnated, how this child was born, and fearing public shame, she abandoned the baby Karna, covered him up with lotus leaves, and put him in the river. And then how Karna was brought up and founded by the chariot Arshia and his wife Radha. And going back to Tagore, he skips all that because he assumes that you know that story. But it is Karna Kunti Sanghat. So it is Kunti who says, why don't you come back and join your biological brothers? Why not we have this battle between tomorrow and all of you? And Karna says, you abandoned me there, and I will stay with my loyalty to the mother who brought me up. And of course there is the story of Draupadi having rejected Karna because he was said to be rude. etc. And Tagore actually gives it a spin which is about failed motherhood. It is about the argument in favor of a casteless society. It is in favor of the decision-making power based on an alternate motherhood which is not biological. So I mentioned it in some detail because to me it's with all the discussion that's going on about motherhood and what it means today, not only in India but globally. Stories like the Karnakunti are likely to be played out in many forms. So just your thoughts on that.
Well, actually, one of my favorite parts of that story is he tells her, I don't know if it's in the Tagore version, but certainly in the Mahabharatas, he says, I will not kill Yudhishthira, I will not kill Bhima, I will not kill the twins. And in the morning, mother, you will still have 5 living sons. And every time I said, my hair stands up, and I think of the fact that he has to say that to her, and how that is also a critique of motherhood. It's not just coming from the outside, but it's coming very much from him. I'm interested that you said that the critique of motherhood, in a sense, is a positive critique, because we're talking about that there are mothers who are not biological, and that we can configure the 21st century family very differently. But what bothers me is that there's a critique of motherhood at all. It's hard. Think of that little girl, she was 16 or something, right? And she had been given by her father to live with her mama, and like some sage, mysterious guy comes, and her mama says, look after him in every way, right? So I just think that, in these critiques of motherhood, or even in Karna's cruelty to his mother, we're forgetting what she might have gone through, what her choices might have been at the time. Did she have a choice other than to abandon her baby? And of course, it's about great, we say it's a cruel thing to do, but imagine how her heart must have broken. So as a feminist, I feel compelled to respond to this idea that motherhood is being critiqued by men, Tagore, in ways that perhaps require a little bit more nuance or a little bit more consideration.
Well, this is a discussion after my own heart. So if Karnakunti Sanwad is Tagore's point of view, then back to Chitranjit Karuni, which is a woman's point of view. And what does she do with the Draupadi and Karna?
Of course.
Because there it's a secret love that Draupadi is supposed to bear towards Karna, which is not obvious in many of the original forms of the Mahabharata or the way it used to be told. But the whole premise of the Palace of Illusions is that Draupadi has forever lived with 5 husbands and longed for a 6th, who is not the husband but could have been the husband because he also was a brother. So if Kunti had said, well, share everything amongst yourselves, in a way it is expected that Karna is the absent husband in that whole story. But again, it intrigues me that when we talk about motherhood, the sources of theorizing that we quote are Julia Kristeva, etc., etc. So why are we not looking at critiques of motherhood? Because what you and I are talking about from 2 different points of view is really the tension about interpreting motherhood that theoreticians are looking at. So why are we not looking at those sources? Because quite often, find theoretical frames somewhere and application somewhere in a rather superficial way. But if we were to look at the impact of the epics and understand them in the light of new knowledge and the expanding horizons of theoretical understanding, we would get a much richer critique.
I wonder why we never think of Sita as a bad mother. An American student pointed this out, and I said, she said, I don't like Sita. I said, how can you not like Sita? She said, she left her children and went away. And I was like, oh, it had never occurred to me in, my feminist brain, like she's leaving this husband who's been less than strong in defending her. I never thought that she was leaving her sons. And also, like a good scholar of epic, you know, she gives her sons to her husband in public, they are recognized as his sons, you know, she's done her job and she goes away, she's a really strong woman. Why do we not include Sita in our criticisms of motherhood? Because we're not allowed to, right? Because Sita is untouchable, beyond critique, unimpeachable. Draupadi, you know, she had 5 husbands. We can talk about her in different ways, you know, so there's an incredible judgment that's built into the way we treat Sita and Draupadi so differently from each other, you know, and we're all complicit in it. Not just the men who are doing it, right? It's also who calls their daughters Draupadi, right? Very particular kind of people on the margins, you know. Yeah, so...
I would completely agree that Sita is beyond interpretation or analysis, because that is the part of it also. There are ways in which Sita has been looked at in the first example of single motherhood. I mean, she had to be abandoned by the state apparatus, not only the family, but the state, by her family. And when she decided to go back to her own mother, the womb of the earth, the 2 boys are now seen as the progeny and the future rulers of Ayodhya. They're grown-up men. She has done her duty. Yeah, well, but by then they already are grown-up enough in those days. They are the princes and they are the heir apparents. And she has done her duty. In fact, recently there was a wonderful seminar that I happened to attend, which was on revenge and forgiveness. And looking back at Sita, that going back into Mother Earth, is it revenge or forgiveness? Because in a way, Ram is left bereft. For 3,000 years he cannot pass on. And he lives single, performs all the ceremonies by having a golden Sita by his side for all the rituals that he has to complete. He's a grieving man for 3,000 years. So isn't that some kind of a punishment? I mean, what I find fascinating about the impact of the epics, and they raise moral and ethical issues for us even today. I mean, when we are talking about motherhood, about revenge, about compassion, about forgiveness, about multiple languages, sexual choices, we are talking about today, and that is why we are where we are. One last question from me, and this is about Sanskrit. Why I'm saying this is because the first time, Arshia, that I read your work before we met was this wonderful translation of that Valmiki Ramayana done and was published by Penguin. Massive, most impressive work. Now, of course, Sanskrit is a language that you know very well. And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because Sanskrit is a beautiful language, it isn't a living language, unlike the living mythology that we are a part of. So, do you see there's a disjunction between a living mythology and a non-living language in the Sanskrit and the mythology?
Yeah, there is a disjunction, but I will also say this, that I am completely a lapsed Sanskritist. Now I'm only a Ramayana. I can only read Ramayana. I can't read anything else. I can't read Kalilaka, panic when I see like sutras and all. And you know, that is something about Sanskrit itself, that when one learns to read Sanskrit, and I learned to read Sanskrit, I don't speak it at all. I learned it in order to reach a text and not, you know, to celebrate a Brahminical culture. I learned Sanskrit because I had to read Ramayana. And I've stayed with that very much. So in Sanskrit, you know, that if you study Shastra, then you learn Shastric Sanskrit. If you read Ramayana, then you learn epic Sanskrit. If you read Kalidasa, then you learn Kavya. And you get very stuck in that way of reading. You stay within your genre and all like that. And as far as, you know, David Shulman has a great story. He teaches, David Shulman is a great Indologist, perhaps the greatest of his generation, our generation. And he teaches at Hebrew University in Tel Aviv, and he has generations and generations of scholars who've worked under him, and you know, they all get fascinated by these stories, and they come to him and say, oh, this story is so nice, I love Ramayana, I love Mahabharata, like, how can I know more about it? I'd really like to. And David says to them, well, you know, you love Mahabharata, well, very good. You should read more translations of Mahabharata, you should read commentaries, you should read what other people have written, you must read around Mahabharata. If you're reading the Mahabharata, you must read Ramayana. you know, and so you won't understand Ramayana without doing. And so you can do it in all of these ways, and then you can do it the easy way, which is they do the learn Sanskrit. You know, and he's right. I mean, what is the big deal? It's a terribly difficult language, yeah. It is really mahapakam, but when you'll never master the language. It's not like, oh, you know, I can read anything in French or I can write a French novel. You'll never be at that stage, right? But the pleasure you get from unpacking a Sanskrit verse, it's fun. I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's become a lost language, or it's receded from our consciousnesses, is because it's gotten involved with all the wrong people. It's being seen, it's been rightly so for centuries as a Brahminical language. I'm neither a Brahmin nor a male nor even a Hindu, right? And in America, it's perfectly okay for me to study Sanskrit and become a Ramayana expert. But the reason why I went in 1984 to America to study Ramayana was because I couldn't do it in India, right? So, I mean, that is the problem. Where are the women? Where are the children? Where are the marginalized people? Where are the Dalits with access to Sanskrit? If everybody had access to Sanskrit, it would not be a good language. You know, we would, just any language enriches people. And this one would, just like any other language, not more. You know, because I know Sanskrit, I'm smarter than everybody else. No, it's just, I know one more language. And that's a good reason to learn another language. If you can learn Sanskrit, good for you.
So Sanskrit is indeed a very beautiful language. People are perhaps going back to the building pockets. So, shall we open it up to some questions? We have some time to take a few questions. Yes, and when you ask your question, please give your name because we are recording this.
So, ma'am,
can we give you a mic? Or shall we just hear you? Okay. Just keep it brief and pointed and about Arshia Sattar.
So there have been many interpretations of women and minor characters from epics and motivated writings, but you think there's a lack of interpretations of villain characters?
Oh God, no, everybody loves the villain. Neelakandan has created an private industry of rewriting the villains. Yeah. No, but you know, like the point I made in my paper, just because you turn a villain into a hero doesn't mean you're attacking the patriarchy in any way. You know, you have a patriarchal villain. Oh, now we're telling the story from Duryodhana's point of view. Oh, you know, so yeah, villains are very attractive. It's sort of, really when you want to turn a story on its head, you tend to use the antagonist to do that. So it's out there. It's just a bit boring because it doesn't sound any different, which is why we haven't noticed, you know, that these are actually stories from the villain's point of view. They sound just like the heroes. And if the heroes were problematic in the first place, why are we telling the same story, the different story the same way?
There's a beautiful story by Amit Chaudhary of Superman.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
And that, again, I don't know whether one would traditionally talk of Superman as a villain, but it's a very sympathetic story as to what brought her to the forest and why did she adopt the human form and why did she go expressing her attraction. And then it's almost as though what was done to her was a villain. So there are ways of, and Amit Chaudhary has a way of telling the story.
There's also Bolga's marvelous story about meeting Shurpanakha later, Sita meets her later.
Yes, and that is what I'm Amrita Bhella, teacher at Jesus and Mary College, and I've been teaching the Mahabharata and absolutely fascinated by it. With reference to what you just said, I just read Kavita Kane's Lanka's Princess, Surupnaka's story. Absolutely outstanding, unputdownable from her point of view. And when you were talking about the range of books now, I just think it's exciting times. Iravati Karve's Yuganta, saying there is nothing that is not there in the Mahabharata. And just what you mentioned, the range of works available. The range, I mean, every person's story from their point of view.
But you know, I feel, Amrita, it's these stories, as you said, there's the range of stories and you know, these different points of view and all of that. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And they have the potential to be subversive if we know the original story. But if we don't, then what is Lanka's Princess? Nothing, you know? So there's still a hollow at the center. You know, we're building up the margin, but that doesn't, and not in a particularly progressive way or in a necessarily relevant way?
Sorry, what is progressive? I read somewhere
I think that's a very fair question.
And a writer in Karnataka warned me on this. Performance of Mahabharata. Every day, oral tradition.
Yes.
On the last day, the actor who acts as Yudhishthira dresses as a woman, runs through the street, and everybody pets him with spoons because of what he did. And the famous writer in Bangalore, I won't name her here, bore out, yes, it happens.
I'm sure that's true, but isn't it interesting that he has to become a woman to be pelted with stones?
Yes.
What is going on here?
Yes.
No, I think that's a very good. What is progressive? I should not use that word lightly. I agree.
So was he a male the way he put Rocky at stake when she says, questions him? And there is a reversal of gender role because she questions him and says, how do you stake when you've lost yourself and I belong to you? The same words. Question.
There's also a weird thing with masculinity going on in Mahabharata, because in Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna says, I can't do this, Krishna says to him, Ma Klaibyam Arjuna, which can be translated to be a eunuch. Right? And when Rambha curses Urvashi, when Urvashi curses Arjuna, when he refuses, she says, you will live as a Klaibya. Right? So there's the Na, Punsaka, Klaibya, and it's always feminized,
And he is handmaiden to the queen.
As Brihanalai becomes Brihanalai.
Yes, please.
My name is Aaron. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you. Can you use the mic?
Sure, I can use this. So I wanted to just offer another conception of motherhood surrounding Sita that actually is done in a film remake of Kanchana Sita, the Malayalam play. There's a 70s remake by G. Aravindan, and Sita is never present as a character, but she's present as Prakriti. She's sort of always a breeze in the wind, and so it's a sort of we sort of talked a little bit, or you talked a little bit about issues of we can possibly criticize her for abandoning. It's just interesting that this sort of, she's never present, she's never with her son, she's never with her husband, she's never with anybody. But she's always above that and beyond that, as sort of Mother Nature, if you will, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. Kanchana Sita, Arvindan's film is just glorious, and it's very 70s, that you can make an abstract film like that from such a visceral, particular story. Thank you.
Yes, please.
My name is Mandira Ghosh. I have a query. Actually not exactly related to the talk you have made, but something is related. In Thailand, Ramayana turns into Ramakya. So in Ramakya, I am told, I am not sure, I want to ask you, the character of Hanuman and Ravana both slightly changes.
A lot
changes. Can you elaborate this fact that how the characters change?
I don't know that much about Ravana, but I've worked with Hanuman now for a number of years, and what has always struck me, it starts in Bengal actually. That in Kritibasa, you start seeing that Hanuman is not a brahmachari at all. In fact, this fish swallows like a drop of his sweat and becomes pregnant, and then he meets his son in the underworld in Patala, and he fights him, and all of that. And once you cross over into Southeast Asia, Hanuman is sexually rampant. He will basically sleep with anything that comes his way, and so why that happens, I don't know. I don't know enough about those cultures to hazard a guess, but it's also true that in Southeast Asian Ramayana, and I forget which one it is, Sita is Ravana's daughter, right? So that's why he can't sleep with her, that's why he can't touch her. And of course, this is all the stuff that Ramanujan says in his 300 Ramayanas essay, which of course we're not even allowed to mention anymore. And the question is, and I think Ramanujan's question remains, that when these central characters become so very different, and when their relationship to each other changes, are they still Ramanas? right? What makes it a Ramayana? And that, you know, I think all of us instinctively know that, array, this is Ramayana. Right? It doesn't matter where it is or it isn't, you know, we should not play into this idea that there's only one Ramayana. But I remember the first time I watched Mani Ratnam's Ravana, and I thought, oh God, what a cheap trick. He's calling it Ravana because he wants us to come, you know, with all this in our head. Okay, oh, this one who's kidnapped, her name is Ragini or something like that. But actually it's Sita, and that, whatever that Abhishek Bachchan character is, and I can't remember the name, that he is Ravana, and that, you know, and I found it really interesting that the Rama character, his name is Deva, right, and he's a police officer, right, and he represents the state, and he represents dharma. So, I mean, Mani Ratnam's metaphors, I've watched the film now 2 or 3 times, they're just stunning, you know, in what he plays with. Of course, Govinda is Hanuman, which is, you know, another thing to get upset about if one wants to get upset. But I still think that Mani Ratnam's Ravana is not a Ramayana film. He wants us to keep Ramayana in our head when we're watching the movie, but it's not Ramayana, you know, so. Yes, please.
And you talked about Ramayana. Like we saw some years back, kind of opposition that like it's not and here on
Yes.
my question is that right now, probably a lot of writers are concerned with the state of freedom of expression in the country and the but if one sees the situation is this, it is very uncommon that a significant part of that kind of backlash is being led by the youth. So issues like criticism of Islam are very touchy. So now here we are trying to move away from this, we are trying to restrict this backlash. But how do we prevent ourselves from moving to a situation where we're living right now, that from the right backlash to the left backlash?
Okay, I think one of the things that has happened in the last 2 years, particularly the last 3 years, is that this category of left is now very shaky, right? And that's very, very unfortunate for somebody like myself who grew up with that as a bulwark of one of my, the kind of person that I wanted to be. But be that as it may, how do we prevent ourselves from, it's not about West is right and left is right and, you know, all like that. As a writer and as somebody who believes very firmly that we must be allowed to say whatever it is that we want to say. If you don't want to hear, you can close your ears, but you can't shut my mouth. I think the way we work against this backlash is that we keep talking. And we talk in as many places as we can, and we speak louder than we have been speaking before. We don't have to say I'm a left person or a right person or a centrist. It's just that my name is Arshia Sattar, I work with Ramayana, this is how I want to do it. That is what I need to say. You can decide whether I'm left, right, center, feminine, human, I don't care. You know, that is no longer important to me, the label under which I speak. But I will speak, and I will speak louder, and I will speak more. That is different from 3 years ago or 4 years ago.
Okay, I'm going to ask if there is any other question. Anamika is not listening to me, but I know she has something. She's done work. Anamika, you've done work on Sita. It's read in the newspaper even 2 or 3 days ago. Do you have any observations to make? You were talking about an alternate Sita, if I remember correctly. There was an interview, a long interview with Anamika.
Yeah, I saw it just this afternoon.
Yeah, just tell us more. It sounded absolutely fascinating.
You know what, I was wondering, we can talk about it later, but I was just wondering why Buddha has in Hindi poetry and in Bhasha poetry.
No, let's stick with the ethics and let's please stick with what Arshia has been talking about.
Okay.
We'll talk about other matters later. Okay.
Yeah, you know, because transplanting classics into, modern context, we go to different sources, and there is Sitayan in Bangla, which talks about that Mandodari, how Mandodari conceived Sita. and also about the dilemmas that this gentleman or somebody talked about, no, Malavi only talked about, how she feels when she finally leaves her children in the custody of the alienated husband. There are certain pieces where this dilemma is brought out. Like there is a scene where Sita takes her children away, and then she consults them. She'd been talking to her, and then they refuse. They said, no, it's okay. We are happy the way we are. And then Valmiki intervenes. There is another question that has been raised: why no one from Mithila comes to take over, meet Sita when she is abandoned. Instead of going to Videha, her own father, she stays at the saint's place, and then there are stories floating all over Mithila, and still no one comes. And Videha, who is supposed to be a disciple of, say, Ashtavakra, a person of his magnitude, even he doesn't say anything, and there is a complete silence. But in folklores and in all kinds of stories that float in Mithilanchal, there are many explanations that Sita's mother also has been shown talking to Sita's father as to why shouldn't they go and get the daughter. And so these are all kinds of, we have to imagine, because there are hints thrown here and there. We have to reimagine things from multiple perspectives and fill in the blanks, because you'll get one word here and one hint there. So we'll have to come up with a quilt, some kind of a patchwork quilt, to get all the perspectives together. That bit of reimaginings are yet to be done, taking the folklores that float in that region. I think we should be working on that.
Absolutely, and again I come back to Ramanujan. This is exactly what he said, that there are 300 Ramayanas. There are women Ramayanas, there are Goan Ramayanas, there are Dalit Ramayanas, there are Muslim Ramayanas, yeah? And so again what Malashri started with, that why do we subscribe to a single dominant narrative? It leaves out more than half of us, yeah? And I have a right to my Ramayana too, and that's what we have to fight for. No, to you, Franz, that the quilt is a great, of course you're a poet, so you would come up with a beautiful metaphor like a quilt, but of course we have to challenge the dominant narrative, which is sexist, patriarchal and casteist. It is, Oh, and all this is on tape, brilliant.
There's another story, very interesting, where Ambai also has written it from the eastern perspective, where Sita wants her ekanta, her silence, to practice Rudraveena. And when Ravan approaches her, she said, okay, let's be friends, because your man has deserted you, now we should be together. And she said, no, everybody has to have his or her own Rudraveena. I can't teach you, I can't take you now.
So, thank you. It's been a very lively afternoon. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. But Gitanjali will have the last word.
First, I would like to say I was part of this whole program, and so I think it's been a very interesting evening and very thought-provoking lecture by Arshia, and why the ancient Indian epics are being told across India and the diaspora. I thank Professor Malashri Lal for the lively, interesting dialogue which she had with Arshia, and also the audience for their active participation.